Thank you all for coming to the 16th Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity. I'm your MC Son Ji-hye. Now we will begin our session on peace treaties in the Middle East, implications and prospects. To open the session, we will have Jang Se-won, President of Dankook University GCC Institute.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Professor Jang Se-eun, the head of GCC of Dankook University. First of all, congratulations on the successful opening of Jeju Forum. Despite the pandemic situation, this forum has been successfully opened. For this, I would like to congratulate for the President Han In-taek of Jeju Research Institute. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you. And this meaningful forum, the GCC Institute of Dankook University was able to hold a special session in Jeju Forum. This is co-hosted with the Jeju Research Institute. I'm very pleased to have this special session in this forum. As a head of institute, I should be on hand. But regrettably, I have another occasion to attend in Seoul, which is the academic conference co-hosted with other institute. So I would like to seek for your understanding. In this special session, former Ambassador Choi Sung-ju is moderating the whole session. Thank you for that. And Professor Abdullah and Minister Nauman Shai, Professor Kim Kang-sok of Dankook Universities are with us. I would like to say thank you for taking their time. And recently, Mr. Nauman Shai is appointed as a minister for Israeli diaspora. And at the same time, I would like to wish for his great role in settling peace in the Middle East. Despite the session will be short, I hope the many discussions and discourses coming out of this session will be helping to settle peace in the Middle East. And lastly, to President Han In-taek and staff of Jeju Research Institute, I would like to extend my greatest appreciation for the preparation. And this concludes my congratulatory remarks. I would like to see the successful proceeding of the special session. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks, President Jang Jin-young. And let me introduce our moderator. We have the head of international cooperation from Ban Ki-moon Foundation for a Better Future, Choi Sung-ju.
Good afternoon to you all, and good morning to the speakers from UAE and Israel. And thank you very much to Director Jang Jae-won of GCC Institute, Dankook University, for your kind introduction. And today we will discuss very important and timely subject which relate to the Middle East situation, particularly about the peace treaties in the Middle East, its implications and prospects. When it comes to Middle East situation, as everybody knows here, recently we have witnessed some very important development in the regional politics, starting from the conclusion of Abraham Accords during the period of former President Trump of the United States. And in May, there was a war between Israel and Hamas during the period of 11 days. And most recently, exactly last week, there was a leadership change in Israel as well as in Iran, two main actors of the regional politics of the Middle East. As for Israel, last Monday, or more exactly Sunday, June 13, new coalition government was launched under the leadership of Prime Minister Bennett. And as for Iran, only last week or so, on June 18, President Raisi was elected as new president of Iran. Having said that, we have all 1 hour and 20 minutes for our current session, for our discussion, starting from presentations of UAE and Israel, as well as Korea. I now introduce briefly two speakers of UAE and Israel to you. From UAE, Dr. Abdul Khalek Abdullah, who is former chairman of Arab Council for Social Science. Also, Dr. Abdullah is very prominent scholar on Gulf and Arab regional affairs. As for Israel, well, we will have Minister Naaman Shai as the speaker. Minister Naaman Shai has been really recently appointed as Minister of Diaspora Affairs within the new Prime Minister's administration. So I also take this opportunity to express my heartfelt congratulations to Minister Shai, and also wish him great achievement in his great endeavor as Minister of Diaspora Affairs. And for Korea, well, we will listen to the presentation from Dr. Kim Gang-seok. He is a researcher at GCC Institute, Dangung University. Since time is running out quickly, so I will start with the presentation by Dr. Abdullah of United Arab Emirates. Dr. Abdullah, you have, hello, nice to meet you, Dr. Abdullah. I'll give the floor to you for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Warm greetings from Dubai, the United Arab Emirates. And I'd like to also thank the Jeju Institute and for having me as a participant in this very important panel today. During the next 15 minutes, I'd like to present a view from the UAE about the Abraham Accord, which is the main topic for today, and a topic that deserves your attention. And I like to focus on three components of the Abraham Accord. The first is the historical component. The second has to do with the realist component of the peace treaty that the UAE signed in September 2020. And the third component or aspects or leg has to do with the idealist component of the Abraham Accord. So there are three legs, pillars, aspects, components of the Abraham Accord coming from a UAE perspective. And let me start with the first one, the historical aspects to this very important development that we have seen in this region, the Abraham Accord. The signing of the accord did not come from vacuum. Indeed, it has a long history, and it is accumulation of a long, tacit, undeclared relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. 10 years in the making, nearly 15 years since 2010. And this accord has been in the making, and it comes as the culmination of a long-term strategic, military, security, technological relationship that was not official, that was tacit, and that was not declared. So it was only about choosing the right time to officialize all of this. And the UAE found out that July 2020 was the right time. It was all done on UAE's watch. It was our own decision, and UAE came into this accord with full confidence of its past, present, and future. So confidence is the key word to understand why the UAE signed this accord. And if you come to the UAE today, visit the UAE today, you see that the country is one of those few countries that is full of confidence of itself. You see it in every aspect, every corner of the country. Confidence is the key to understand UAE's decision, why it took such a huge risk, such a huge decision to sign a treaty with Israel. And today, UAE is probably more confident of itself than it has been in its 50 years. So confidence is the key to me to understand why the UAE ventured into this, declared it, came to the open and said, it is time for me to have now an official relationship and sign the document with America being in prison in September 2020. That's the first one. This accord did not come out of vacuum, but it came out of a long, very important relationship that the two countries had, but that was tacit and declared. The second component to the Abraham Accord from UAE perspective has to do with the realist school. Realism dictated it. And here, let me take 1 minute to explain why this realist aspect is very important to the accord from UAE perspective. UAE believes that there is a long war conflict that plagued this region as a result of Israel's occupation of Palestine. And for 70 years, there were 5 wars. For 73 years, Arabs boycotted Israel. None of this worked. So realistically speaking, UAE is saying, let's try different approach. We had enough of war. We had enough of boycott. Let's try normalization. Maybe normalization will bring peace to the region and solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue and will bring a state to the Palestinians, something that they deserve. And it has not been coming for 70 plus years. Also, from a realist perspective, the UAE saw a lot of benefits in having relationship with Israel in open. Strategic benefits, technological benefits, commercial benefits, political benefits, benefits of all sorts. So it came out of UAE's national interest, pure and simple, that made the UAE sign this treaty. It strengthened our relationship with America. It consolidated the image of the UAE as a peacemaker. UAE's standing globally has benefited UAE's global posture. It is also delivered on whatever benefits the UAE can get from associating with Israel on scientific and technological fronts. So all in all, there is a lot of benefits. So what drove the UAE in the second place was this national interest, pure and simple. And hopefully we will have to now see if that benefit materializes. Now there is a third component, and the final one, that has to do with the idealist also thinking about the Abraham Accord, which is a very important component, but I will consider it the weakest of all. And what this has to do, this idealist component has to do with the fact that the Abraham Accord that was signed in September 2020 was supposed to aim to promote peace and stability in the region. That was the idealist component, the historical, the realist, and the idealist component. Now, whether this Abraham Accord brings peace or doesn't bring peace, brings stability or doesn't bring stability, is a long-term goal. It's not the immediate aim of this ideal, of this Abraham Accord. But we have seen two things. One, the first test of the accord came just 2 weeks ago during the Israel-Hamas conflict. And it just shows that peace is very difficult to achieve. Israel is bent on building more settlements. Israel is bent on waging war out of feeling that it is a strong, out of feeling that it is arrogant with whatever power that it has. So peace probably as important component as it is of the Abraham Accord is very difficult to achieve. We've gone through the first test, and the first test just showed how difficult it is. So finally, what I say here to wrap up all of this, I think the idealist part is important, but it's the weakest part. And the reason for that is because we do not have an Israeli partner for peace. Netanyahu was not interested in peace. He was interested in building settlement. The new government that Your Excellency talked about is also an expansionist government in terms of settlement. And as long as Israel goes into this settlement mode and expanding settlement in the West Bank, and so peace is going to be something of illusion, and it's going to be the weakest component of the Abraham Accord. Historical component, realistic component, and idealist component, however, is very important to understand why the UAE signed the Abraham Accord in September 2020. Thank you for having me, and I'll be more than happy to engage and answer any questions that you have, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah, for your excellent presentation with the very in-depth and professional analysis by introducing us three components about the meaning, historical meaning of Abraham Accords. Now, well, it's time for us all to start some discussion together with the Q&A. So for your presentation, we have two Korean experts, Dr. Kim Gang-seok and Dr. Jung Jin-han from GCC Institute at Dankook University of Korea. So I'll pass Dr. Kim and Dr. Jung the floor, and you have the floor, sir. And when you start on discussion and Q&A, of course, first I recommend you to focus on Dr. Abdullah's presentation, the contents, main contents of his presentation, and together with more concrete questions, but to focus more in depth about our discussion. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Abdul Khalik Abdullah, for your very insightful comments and summary of background of the Abraham Accords. I'm very moved by your very thoughtful analysis regarding this normalization between Israel and the UAE. So I totally agree with your analysis. First of all, you point out that this normalization did not come from vacuum. So I know that the ongoing relationship between UAE and Israel is prosperous since the establishment of IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency in Abu Dhabi. After that, many politicians can easily interact with the UAE and the Israel. Also, you point out that the fatigue of war, for instance, many long legacies of war actually, because of this fatigue, might be generated new initiative such as normalization moves. I really agree with it. And then you point out some mechanisms of the Abraham Accords inside there. 2002 Arab Initiative actually agreed with all Arab countries can make a deal with normalize Israel until Palestine problems were settled. But there is some kind of controversy regarding this, I know. But my question is related to the, first of all, your realistic analysis, first of all. I think UAE can have some benefits realistically from this normalization. UAE is nowadays is not a minor player in the Middle East, since especially in the wake of the Arab Spring in 2011, UAE pursued more proactive and foreign security policy in the region, intervening in Libyan civil war, for instance, Yemen, for instance, even including horns of Africa and East Mediterranean gas. I know. So interesting case is that in May 2019, a Korean citizen who had been detained for 315 days by armed group in Libya was actually released. The rescue of a Korean hostage was possible because of UAE authorities, which had very friendly relationship with the Libyan National Army, LNA, had a very good active role in negotiating his release, which shows UAE is now actively involving in the Libyan civil war. So my question is, I think the normalization relations is expected to further contribute to the UAE's this kind of active diplomacy, particularly when US is now withdrawing from the region. Many my traditional allies, UAE and even including Israel, is thinking about that United States is now hesitant to take active role in maintaining security order in the region, may about to leave. For instance, Trump administration implemented foreign military commitments by retrenchment. So my thinking is that by supporting this solidarity of regional allies, including UAE and Israel, United States wants to burden sharing, and then take the UAE maybe in conclusion, in the wake of hesitancy of US involvement, UAE can have another momentum to take more active foreign policy in the region. That's my realistic question. And another thing is some different sides of that is that I see some public opinion index conducted by some research center based on Doha. which shows that the Arab people's public opinion is not that good for normalizations, which means policymakers, governments actually said that this treaty is quite beneficial. But the ordinary Arab people's public opinion is, I think, not that such shows their genuine hospitality. So, I mean, is it true or not? I'm not sure whether, because sometimes Arab survey is politically biased. But I want to listen about your opinions, ordinary Arab people's opinion also. If it is true, if negative opinions of among Arab public opinions, how UAE governments or Arab governments can address these problems? Because if the Arab people's mind, public opinion is not that good, which is the obstacle for contributing to one peace between the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Abdullah, you have the floor for your answer and for your more in-depth analysis, if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. I listened to the comments and the questions. They are profound and they are very interesting. And I probably agree with many of the things Dr. Kim has said. But let me also probably answer some of his very interesting questions, starting with the last one and going back very quickly. Public opinion in the Arab world is against normalization. I think it is true. You don't have to go through public polls to show it. It is something that we all share in many respects because Israel is not allowing us to live in peace. Every day there is a brutality committed by the Israeli against the Palestinians. And this has been going on for the past 70 years, and it is non-stopping. Every single day, we see that on television, we see that on social media, we see how the Palestinians are striving to have a state of their own, and you have an occupying force that is preventing all of this, and it is doing it in a very brutal way. So don't blame Arab public opinion being against normalization, being anti-Israeli. This is a fact of life. And as long as Israel keeps on practicing brutality against the Palestinians in such a way, in a daily way, I, for one, and millions of Arabs will be against normalization. Second, UAE public opinion is very important too. How is UAE reacted? It reacted very positively on the ground that probably 80% and more of UAE public, of UAE people, of UAE citizens trust government decision no matter what that decision is. Trust of government is at all-time high in UAE. It is second in the world according to latest Edelman index of trust in government. UAE citizens have the second highest trust in government. Nearly 80% and more trust UAE, whether they go normalization, whether they go to war, whether they go to moon, whether they go to Mars. People trust in government is at all-time high in the UAE. So people trust the government rather than are pro-normalization. They are pro-government more than they are pro-normalization. Coming to your question about UAE as a rising regional power. Today, UAE is a rising regional power. The UAE has become lately as a middle power, not a small state, not a big state, of course. We are somewhere in the middle power. We've been classified like some 36 different countries in the world as a middle power. And this came after 50 years of development, of being an economic power. We are the second biggest economy in the region and the number 26 biggest economy worldwide. We have the biggest sovereign wealth, the second biggest wealth sovereign wealth fund. We have diversified our economy more so than any other economy away from oil. We have aviation sector, tourism sector, financial sector, etc., etc. So the UAE, and on top of all of this, the UAE has built the second best air force in the region after Israel. So the UAE projects power, and it is all over the place. And that's why the UAE is full of confidence these days, because it has all of this, and this is what I call the UAE momentum. There is a UAE momentum, and this momentum will be here for the foreseeable future. And as a result, you see us in Yemen, in Horn of Africa, in Mediterranean, all over the place. And we have friends, not just in the region, but all over the world, from Tokyo in east all the way to Washington and everything in between, including Seoul. They are, partners of the UAE and trusted partners of the UAE. So the UAE will need to take some share of responsibility. And this is your question about burden sharing. If America has decided or is deciding to leave the region incrementally, gradually, then we, the region power, have to take responsibility for the stability and the security in the region. And the UAE is the best country to cooperate with everybody. And now, as we talk now, UAE is in cooperation with Israel. It is a fact of life. Israel is a fact of life, and UAE is now in the developing its relationship. And hopefully the Israelis are good partners and faithful partners, and hopefully they will deliver peace. And if they do, there will be more countries following UAE to sign the Abraham Accord.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah, for your very concrete, very convincing explanation about Dr. Kim Gang-seok's questions to you. And now, Dr. Zhang, you have the floor. Please, go ahead.
It's really nice to meet you, Dr. Abdel Khaliq. Yeah. Thank you for listening your deep insight and the very comprehensive explanation in 3 dimensions. And also I appreciate the Jeju Forum to invite such serious and figures to explain in very practical time schedule and highlighting 3 aspects. Yeah, you accentuated 3 aspects. The first one is the historic one, and the second is realistic, and third is the idealistic. I also, for me, 3 questions emerged in each part. Yeah, the first thing is the historical things. I don't know the details of the chronological design of this Abraham Accords through 10 years, but including me, the majority of Koreans misunderstood that Abraham Accords was constructed not by one precisely designed. I mean, UAE, you told me that you chose the time when you get the confidence, maybe eventually the normalizations among Arab countries and Israel was concentrated the second half of the 2020, just right before this re-election of Donald Trump. So, I mean, so the other, what about the other countries? Like the Bahrain was prepared enough, or eventually, yeah, they signed almost together, and other countries as well, like the Morocco and other countries. So many of foreigners understood that was not chosen by UAE, but like the US, set the time schedule, which is to maximize the beneficial for the Donald Trump's election. So did you adjust the time with Bahrain or other countries, which is related to the following withdrawal of other normalization, like Oman, was about to sign, to normalize with Israel. But once the Donald Trump's election was failed, it was installment. And the second question is about the second and third question is about the instability. I mean, one is internal one and one is external one or regional one. Is some share with the commonalities with Kim Gang-seok's question. That as long as I know, the UAE, you accentuated 80% of the UAE supports the Abraham cause. But as long as I know, there are some discrepancies between like Abu Dhabi and Dubai and the other Emirates, especially several Emirates has different religious view and the attitude towards not only Israel, but Iran as well. So, I mean, opportunities always opportunity is always accompanied by risks. So some regional, I mean, some Emirates, this contentment would stimulate some instability, especially you can consider the extremists would be provoked several violent actions. And the second one is the regional instability. I definitely agree with you that normalization, diplomatic normalization with Israel should contribute to the regional peace. But on the other hand, especially with Iran, normalization with UAE was conditioned under the sustaining the huge and strong sanction upon Iran. So on the other hand, it sounds like regional stability would be harmed. And especially currently, the Biden government, the stance is some between the Trump's one and the other one. So it became unstable. I think so. So I'd love to listen to your opinion for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I invite Dr. Abdullah to answer the questions. But when you do that, please try to make it briefer in view of the time limitation for our session. Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. You have the floor.
Thank you, sir. And thank for three very profound comments and questions by Dr. Jung. And I appreciate this kind of challenging question. And let me take the few minutes available to answer them all. I still insist that the timing of this accord is a UAE chosen rather than the Trump administration. Probably the Trump administration, Dr. Jung, chose the timing of the sign of the treaty, which is September, but the UAE declared its intention to establish relationship well before in July. So I still strongly believe that it is important to look at each one country, the three countries' motivations, and which is the United States, Israel, the United Arab Emirates. But as far as I am concerned, and from everything that I could gather, the UAE is in the driver's seat when it comes to the Abraham Accord. It is in the driver's seat. Everything is done on UAE's watch, not on Israel's watch or US watch. We could pull out any time, just as we came in at any time. So I think the UAE owns the Abraham Accord more so than the Israelis and the American. That's my belief, and we could debate this if you want to, but unfortunately, we don't have time. So that's my first answer to your profound question. The second question has to do with the fact that 80% of UAE trust government. That is established in all the indicators worldwide. Okay, so there's a huge reservoir of trust, citizens' trust of UAE's government. And this is due to the fact that 50 years of solid record the UAE government has delivered. So there is a huge reservoir of trust when it comes to the UAE, and many people who supported normalization did not necessarily support normalization with Israel as such, but supported government's decision to normalize a relationship. And these are two different things, and we could once again see, and debate this. And there is no differences whatsoever between Dubai and Abu Dhabi when it comes to strategic decisions. And this notion that there is Dubai and there is Abu Dhabi and there are differences between them, I think many of it comes from Western scholars and Western literature, and we over here, a view from within UAE, don't see this kind of differences when it comes to strategic decisions such as normalization. So that's not true. But also, I like also to point out that this was not an easy decision to take, to normalize a relationship with Israel. Okay, this is a huge, risky decision. But usually leaders, and UAE today is a leader in the region, usually leaders, whether individual or state, take risky decision, calculated decision. And there are those who don't like it, and there are those who will be pro and like it. So naturally, many people criticize the UAE, many people meaning state-wise or even popular-wise, whether it is within the UAE or in the Arab region. But the UAE has taken this decision out of strategic necessity and out of political calculations. And finally, Iran is a huge destabilizing force in the region. For the past 40 years, since 1979, Iran has been a headache to the country around it. And we, the UAE, are the closest to Iran. And we have our island occupied by Iran. And every single day for the last 40 years, we've been hearing threats coming from Iran. The air is full of threats, Iranian threats, every day against Hormuz, Strait of Hormuz, and against us, and against everything else. So we live next to Iran. It's a very difficult neighbor, which is going to get even more difficult after the election of the hardliner Ibrahim Raisi. So it's a fact of life. Iran is a destabilizing force, and it's a push factor to Israel too, for many countries, including UAE, Bahrain, and probably others too. I don't want to take more of your time, but I really enjoyed all these questions and the session. And hopefully one day we'll visit Jeju to enjoy the hiking, the highest mountain in Korea, and meet you all in person. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah, for your excellent conclusion. Really, thank you for your time, and thank you very much for your great contribution to our session. Certainly, we are looking forward to welcoming you in Korea in person when the situation permit us to do so in the future. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me. Ma salama. Bye-bye.
And now, I will turn to the Minister Shai of Israel, who certainly is waiting actually for his presentation. And Minister Shai, you have the floor. And also, I know Ambassador of Israel is also with us now to listen to Minister Shai's presentation. Ambassador of Israel, thank you very much for your presence. And certainly, Minister Shai, you have the floor. And I look forward to your great contribution as well. You have the floor, sir, Mr. Shah. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, everyone. And special thanks to Israel's ambassador, Ambassador Akiva Tur, one of Israel's best diplomats, now serving our country in South Korea. And he will be probably very helpful to build and maintain the relationship between South Korea and Israel. I welcome you all to this discussion. I have to add one word, very on a personal, but also, let's say, on professional and national level. I feel upset about the behavior of Dr. Abdullah. I came to this conversation to talk openly with him and with you, and the very fact that, and I attended his opening remarks and the entire discussion. And I feel that he's he chose to behave totally differently when he left the discussion right now, ignoring my remarks. This is not typical to the Israeli-UAE relations, just the opposite. I would say this is a spirit that doesn't exist currently, or maybe I'm not aware of it, in the relationship between Israel and UAE. Because we've been working together with UAE for over 10 years to build relations, either economic or intelligence or in other areas crucial to both countries. And finally, it materialized in this peace accords between the Abraham Accords between Israel and UAE. And we have been able, fortunately, to overcome animosities, hatred, conflict, interest by being hopefully both of us interested in peaceful relations between us and them. I think this is the right spirit. And the very fact that the other participant choose to boycott me is something that belongs to the past. Ladies and gentlemen, it belongs to the past. We are heading forward. We are heading towards a new chapter in the relationship between Israel and other states and other countries in our region. And I hope very much that the peace that started, the first peace treaty was signed between Israel and Egypt in the late 70s. And then another peace treaty was signed between Israel and Jordan in 1993. And now, finally, we have developed peaceful relations with 4 new Arab countries, with UAE, with Bahrain, with Sudan, and with Morocco. This is what we have. This is the symbol. This is the spirit. This is the message that we are conveying, not only here in our region, but even to your region. I hope that peace will prevail. This is this is not about me. This is about Israel and about the new government in Israel. We would like to see peace in our region because peace will produce different geopolitical situation that will develop. It helps to develop Israel and to develop our neighboring countries. So injecting again this position to the dialogue is just destructive, and I condemn it. Now go back to the original message from Israel. As I said before, it started the relationship between Israel and UAE started like 10 years ago. And it developed into a full diplomatic relations brokered by the United States, and I am fully acknowledge that, and also thankful to the U.S. government, to former President Trump and Jared Kushner, Avi Berkovich, all of them from the president's staff that helped very much to come to that point. And the UAE Abraham Accord and the UAE agreements between Israel has been followed by another Arab states, by Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Very, very promising future for Israel and for those countries. The first visit of the new foreign minister, Yair Lapid, who is also the alternate prime minister, next week, the first one is where? UAE. We want to establish those relations. We want to cement them. We want to strengthen them. We want to make sure that even after the Hamas attacked Israel, I repeat, the Hamas attacked Israel recently, and there was unfortunately another circle of violence, and the peace treaty continued, was maintained, and was not harmed by this another violent attack of the Hamas, the terror organization in Gaza against Israel. As an Israeli who has been working all his life for peace, I'm very proud to see that step after step, first after step, we build relations with our neighbors. And it's not only political relations, it's about economy. That's also a message to you one day between you and your neighbor from the north. Let the economy, let give the business a chance to speak. And I know you have a lot to offer on that. So we have economic relations, political relations, diplomatic relations, and also, I would say, humanitarian relations. People are traveling. Thousands and thousands of Israelis, Jews and Arabs alike, have been traveling back and forth to the UAE, visiting the people of UAE, talking to them, building relations. That's the story. That's what the story is all about. We have been looking for that for many, many years. And finally, it happened. So thank God, we can see a bright future for the Middle East in general and for our relations with our neighboring countries. You all know, ladies and gentlemen, Israel is a high-tech nation. We have a lot to offer, and we also have a lot to get. It's not one-sided relation. We have a lot to do for and with our neighbors, and we hope very much they can do with us. We can offer a cooperation on energy. The natural gas was found in the Mediterranean. We can negotiate about where to sell it and how. And we also would like to help UAE, maybe even by building a pipeline through Israel to help them export their oil. I can see other areas, technology, culture. I mean, when we finally start diplomatic relations, it's not only about diplomacy, it's about public diplomacy, people to people. That's a dream. A dream was materialized. And that's why I was a little bit disappointed when I saw my colleague disappearing. No, just the opposite. If we have something to talk about, let's do it here and now. Only dialogue between enemies, former enemies. I don't know how much enemies we were anyhow with UAE is the right way. Keeping this old spirit doesn't help anyone, does not produce any good, neither for UAE nor for Israel. So I'm really very happy that our foreign minister and alternate prime minister is going to UAE. We welcome, we have now an embassy of UAE in Israel and an Israeli embassy in UAE. And I can assure you, we are going to continue this line, and we invite other Arab countries to join in. They can only gain from that, nothing to lose. We will do everything to keep the peace between them and us and for many, many years to come. This is the initial message that I have from you, and now I'm open for your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister Shai, for your very comprehensive and very passionate explanation about.
That's the way I am.
Yes.
That's the way I am.
Yes, really. Thank you very much for your passion for the future, passion for the future friendship between Israel and Arab countries. Particularly, your emphasis on the multiple level relationship, not only political, economic, diplomatic, but also humanitarian, and in the end, the people-to-people relationship is very, I can say, very impressive and very important for the friendly relations among member states of United Nations in the future. That said, for this sub-session with Minister Shai, we have two discussants. One is Dr. Jung Jin Han, researcher at the GCC Institute of Dangung University. And the second one is Dr. Im Hye-young, who is a research fellow at Jeju Peace Institute. post-organization of this ongoing Jeju Forum. So I'll start with Dr. Zhang. You have the floor. And when you make a comment on or ask questions, make your own efforts to make it as brief as possible, taking into account the time limitation allocated to our session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to meet you, Dr. Nachman Shai, the prominent journalist, a military veteran, and scholar and politician. Yeah, you were a prominent journalist, and I love to. Not only for my profession, but I'm enjoying reading Israeli medias, including like Jerusalem Post, and recently more frequent than once a week, I'm reading the articles like the Israel is warning to attack Iran. Yeah, 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 yeah. Especially when the election starts and when you recognize that the Biden will gonna win and release the sanctions. So, I understand now the UAE, the Abraham Accords stabilized, so you don't need to negotiate probably. But for the expandability, when you need to expand the other normalization process, I don't know whether you can cooperate well with the new American government as a negotiator. It's the first question, and the second one is a very brief one. And yeah, what is your ultimate destination of the expandability? The range will cover like several countries out of the GCC members, like the Syria or like Egypt, not Egypt, but Libya. I don't know. Where is your final destination? That's my questions. Salome, thank you so much.
Yeah, I thank you for the question, and I'm glad you enjoy Israeli media and even sometimes my articles. That makes me happy. I fully understand your question, but I didn't understand what you said about the end. Where are we heading to? But I would like to say a few words about, so you can follow it up. But I wanted to say something about Iran. Iran is a common enemy of Israel and UAE, but it's an enemy of the world peace and the world stability. And there should be no doubt about that. And you understand that, you and our friends in South Korea better than anyone maybe in the world. We will not let Iran become a nuclear state. I shouldn't repeat that because it was stated more than once by Israeli prime ministers and even the present prime minister, the new one. Israel will do its utmost to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And we both, South Korea and Israel, understand what it means that when and if one of our neighbors get into this nuclear era, what does it mean in terms of our security, national security? So we are not warning, and we are not getting to the military language here, and I don't want to do it because my message here is peace and not war. But everyone should understand in the room, there and here, that Iran, nuclear Iran, is a huge danger to the world security, not only to the region security. And that's why we are committed to stop Iran, and the international community is already, and the United States is. And I stop here because I think the message was already delivered. Now, Israel, as I said before, is hopeful, is optimistic when it comes to UAE and its neighboring countries. We are optimistic. This is something that we've been waiting for quite a long time. We believe in peace. Yes, we have to be strong militarily, like your country, but at the same time, we have to make any effort. And my good friend, like Ambassador Tur, will fully understand it. We will make any effort to break the hatred, the wall of hatred, and the walls of hatred and animosity and boycott against Israel, and finally pave the way for an overall peace, comprehensive peace between us and their neighbors. And this is the message not of me personally and not of my political party, but of the new government of Israel.
Thank you very much, Minister Shai, for your answer. Very, very interesting and at the same time very detailed answer. And now I will give the floor to Dr. Im Hae-young. You have the floor, sir.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Minister Norman Shai, and also congratulations on your appointment of the Minister of the Diaspora. And I think I might be able to say from the history of between the Israel and Arab countries, to me it looks like it's some gradual achievement of Israel stateness as a modern state. As you know, still the Israel as too many Arab countries is still occupied the territory. But as you know, it's 1979 you made a normalization pact with Egypt, and 94 it was with Jordan, and also just 2 years ago, it was last year with UAE. And even though all these peace agreement is called peace agreement, to me, it's the essence of this peace agreement is more likely state recognition. Israel is recognized as a state among these Arab countries. By doing this, you can get non-intervention or non-aggression, which is example, or it's very explicit in UN Charter. I might be able to say it looks to me it's kind of a hub and spoke model. You try to achieve your peace through this one by one negotiation with each of the Arab countries, and also while Israel has pursued this individual normalization with these Arab countries, but also this also reflects that the Arab countries are also being changed. They are not acting like just one Arab country. They are acting like just one individual modern state. It seems to me these Arab areas or Middle East being changed as a modern state system. But just one thing I would like to ask: while Israel pursued engagement outside of these the relations between Israel and the Palestinian, it doesn't look like to me you're making every effort to engage in Palestinian as you used to do in 1990s. So if there's some reason for that, I would like to get some answers for that. Also, the second question is also related. It might be already asked by Dr. Zhang, and what could be the next stop, and what could be the next country you might be able to individual normalization pact with, with. So that's my two questions.
Yeah, okay. May I answer? Thank you again for the question, and I again thank all the audience, which I don't see, but I welcome to this dialogue. Not much of a dialogue, two monologues. Guys, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, I would like to say a few words. We have a national unity government now in Israel, made of 8 different political parties. It's not a simple matter politically, and it's hard to please every faction, every political party, and every member of the new government. But we have some common goals, and we're going to achieve them. One of them is to normalize relations with our neighbors, like the one with UAE, and we'll continue to do that with other Arab states. I mean, you asked me more than once, who comes next? I don't know, but I hope very much that if they watch the situation between Israel, UAE, Israel, Bahrain, Israel, Morocco, Israel, Sudan, they will get them, and of course Egypt and Jordan, based on the past peace agreement, they will realize that it works for the benefit of those states in any aspect, security-wise, economically, culturally, education, technology, everything will be every aspect will be met. So other Arab countries, we will be calling them from any international forum, even for this one. Please join in, come in, talk to us. We are just waiting for that moment. We are just waiting for that moment. When it comes to the Palestinian issue, it's not a simple matter. We all know, but we are committed. Israelis from all kind of, from the entire political spectrum, to find a way to live side by side with the Palestinian people. My party sides with two nation states for two people. Other parties as well. The Netanyahu's government also, years ago, adopted the two nation state for two people. Well, in between there were some variants. But at the end of the day, most of the Israelis would like to see peace. Most of the Israelis understand that peace means compromise. And I believe, and I'm very confident that when the day comes, we'll find a solution. We'll find a solution to our relations with the Palestinians. They are entitled to have their own independent state. And I'm very hopeful that when they look around, the Palestinians, and when I'm looking out of my window, I see Palestinians now. Well, Palestinian villages and Palestinian people walking in the streets here. We live together. We live in Israel with 2 million Arabs that are relating to the Palestinians as their brothers and sisters. We live with them peacefully. So there's no reason whatsoever that we wouldn't find the political structure that will enable in the future for us, Jews and Arabs, to live side by side peacefully. And I'm hoping and I'm praying for that day to come.
Thank you so much, Minister Shai, for your time. And particularly, thank you very much for your great contribution. And your presentation and your comment, your explanation enriched our debate, our discussion. And particularly, you're right. You said peace means compromise. You are right. So, I look forward to welcoming you, Minister Shai, to Korea when the situation, particularly pandemic situation, allows us to do so. So meanwhile, I wish you all the best and great success, and particularly great contribution for the future relations, prosperous and peaceful relations between Israel and Arab countries. Thank you very much.
Oh,
See you next time.
But let me add one word. Of course, another priority is, of course, Israel-South Korean relationship, which we care very much for. We have a lot of admiration to South Korea, to the great achievements of your country. And as I said before, my colleague Akiva Tur, Ambassador Korea, is in the audience there, and you can rely on him that he will do his best to make those relationships as active and fruitful as possible. So I thank you very much for this symposium and giving me the opportunity to share my own views with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And now, we are almost at the end of our session. We have just 10 minutes before concluding the current session. And since this session will be run only among Koreans, particularly starting with your presentation, very brief presentation in Korean, and your comments and questions in Korean. Please, you have the floor, Dr. Kim first. Thank you.
예, 그 아브라함 협정에 대해서 그
About the Abraham Accord, we have great observations from the two stakeholders in the Middle East, and this accord would have some implications on the Korean Peninsula. The context is very different from the Middle East. So it is hard to simply compare the two situations. UAE and Israeli situation, they don't have a historical animosity. And Camp David Accord was in 1979, and the Jordan Treaty was in the 1980. After the war, UAE was created in 1971. After that, there was a peace accord. So the pace of development is different from the Korean Peninsula. However, we can still find two implications. First one is that in terms of Korean Peninsula and Middle East, the stakeholder states have very different national interests. In Korea, Japan, China, Russia, the superpowers have a strong national interest over the Korean interest over the Korean Peninsula. So the Chinese concern over North Korea, for example, worked as a restraint in peace process. One interesting is that Abraham Accord was led by the United States. Some say that it was the U.S. idea to block advancement of China. During the debate, we have not discussed this point much. However, the United States tried to contain China's One Belt, One Road initiative presence in Middle East. For example, the diplomatic course and during the Trump administration said the UAE and Israel, they are the traditional allies. However, they are geographically close to China. So the United States wants to bind the allied countries to prepare for any contingencies in the Middle East. And China was now opposing to the Abraham Accord. The United States entered the Iraqi war under the banner of a democratic presence. The basic strategy in there is the development of peace. So peace can be settled through the development. So basically, there were a lot of roundtables and discussions on Abraham Accord. However, this accord has a great economic implications in terms of trade and a lot of commercial transactions. So through the economic initiative, the United States wanted to make peaceful momentum. And China's One Belt, One Road initiative could be helped by the Abraham Accord in a sense. So when we convince China, this kind of ideas could be borrowed for us to settle the peace on the Korean Peninsula. And security issue in the Middle East could be learned from the Middle East. In 2020, Waqasim Sulaiman, the commander of Iran, was killed by U.S. drone. Korean army is stationed there. They are doing operation in Aden Gulf. The U.S. wanted to bring the outsiders like us to this area. So when tension goes up in the Middle East, so the Korea-U.S. alliance may kick off the operation. So that could be one important lesson. And the other implication of the Abraham Accord is this. The Minister Shai said of importance of Korea and Israel. The bilateral relations goes beyond the borders of two countries to involve relations with the Arabic world. So if the peace treaty is well implemented, then the Korea could be more proactive to make a presence in there. Israel is our FTA partner. At that time, the tricky point was in the FTA negotiation was that how can we label the made in Israel on the product produced in the West Bank area? So peace treaty will help us to make advancement into the Middle Eastern market. Our embassy has been shut down in the past. So the peace there would be greatly influence the Korean market and Korean operation.
We don't have a lot of time left, so can just one of you ask a question? And please just make a simple comment. So thank you for your great insight. I have just one question. Maybe you will be getting similar questions. So the question is, well, now the U.S. administration is changed, and under the Biden administration, do you think that the normalization of the Middle East would be widened, or do you think that it will be backtracked? Well, with the new U.S. administration, there are differing opinions from academia. But the general opinion is that the momentum would be smaller compared to the Trump administration. During the Trump administration, Iran was put into the common proponent, and strategically it tried to have a block or a barrier against Iran. But with the new Biden administration, it is trying to find a new momentum with Iran. Of course, there are still some issues to be resolved. And there is Mr. Khrushchev, and he had a lot of interest in the Middle East issue. And Khrushchev, he has created some kind of Middle East Institute. Of course, within the academia, we have a lot of debate. However, I think that this normalization of relations, the mood would be weakened in the new Biden administration. That's my thought. Well, the time is almost up. Thank you for keeping the time and making a very brief comment. So we had two experts, Dr. Abdullah from UAE and Minister Shai from Israel, and they have made such an excellent presentations, and what they said during their presentations were very meaningful, and I want to touch upon that. Minister Shai mentioned about the nuclear issue of Iran. He was being very strong about that. Well, in Korea, we have the nuclear issue of the North. So if you compare the nuclear issue of the North and Iran, we can say that the nuclear issue of Iran is even more tricky. I think Iran is being very smart. Iran cooperates with IEA in areas where it can cooperate. But in case of North Korea, it's playing dumb. It's a dumb proliferator, while Iran is a smart proliferator. So there is P5 and Germany and Iran for the IEA discussion, but for the North issue, there aren't many supporters. So for the Iranian issue, there are Arabic countries who are also involved. So it means that the dynamic is even greater for the case of Iran. But the North is a dumb proliferator. So since 2002, in 2006, 2007, 2009, it continued with the nuclear experiments. 6 rounds of nuclear experiments. It's just blindly challenging the world and the UN resolution. It has been receiving 10 UN resolutions. It's not fulfilling or complying with the UN resolution. So I can say that in case of the Iranian nuclear issue, it's more complicated due to the geopolitical issue. So very subtle approach is needed. And that is why for the peace of the Middle East, we need more interest from the international community. And this Abraham Accord, although it was struck during the Trump administration, it is very important. We cannot stress its importance enough. And it's so meaningful that we have discussed this topic during our session. So thank you very much for your interest in this topic, and I want to ask for your continued support. Thank you, moderator and presenters and panelists, for your valuable insight and input. So we will close our session here. Thank you for your attention.